The day I restored this old cabin, I didn't just piss off the HOA. I exposed their 30-year lie. They sent security to threaten me, on my own land, with a fake map. That's when I realized this wasn't a neighborhood dispute. This was a war they thought I'd lose. Most people think buying a cabin by a quiet lake means peace, solitude, a slow kind of healing only time and silence can offer. And maybe that's what I thought too, at least for a while. But the truth is, the day I signed the deed to that old 1923 fisherman's cabin, I wasn't just buying property. I was stepping straight into someone else's long-buried battlefield. I found it through a private, barely advertised auction, the kind where people whisper more than they talk, and the listings are meant for folks who still respect old timber and forgotten history. The cabin looked like it had survived 3 hurricanes and a bad marriage. Roof sagging, dock leaning, windows crooked like a drunk trying to stand straight. But even in that wreck, I saw something stubborn, something proud, something that refused to die. I'd spent the past year drifting after losing my closest friend, the kind of man who didn't need to speak to be understood. After the accident, I boxed up my tools, walked out of the workshop, and swore I'd never take on another old structure again. But life has a way of nudging you back toward the things you thought you'd buried. So, I bought the cabin, just like that. And from the moment the ink dried, the staring began. Not the harmless kind, not curiosity. It was quieter than that, sharper than that. Joggers slowed as they passed my driveway, eyes fixed a little too long. Paddleboarders drifted close to my shoreline, saying nothing, pretending to look at the water, while their heads stayed angled toward the cabin. It was the kind of attention you feel before you understand it, like a pressure or a weight settling on your shoulders. I told myself it was nothing. Small town habits. People curious about the new guy. But as the days went on, the stares grew colder. Conversations at the general store died when I walked in. A man on the trail muttered about outsiders messing with the lake, as if speaking to the ground would keep me from hearing it. It didn't make sense to me then, but it would, because the only thing more territorial than an HOA is an HOA with something to hide. Lake Wind Pine sat just across the property line, perfect lawns, perfect hedges, perfect little world, too perfect. And perfection always comes at a cost someone doesn't want to talk about. I didn't know it yet, but they had spent decades trying to erase everything that didn't fit their vision. Everything that didn't match their colors and their rules. And my cabin, rotted, crooked, full of history and scars, was a reminder of a past they wanted dead. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I'd survived. And they sure as hell didn't know what that cabin meant to me. I didn't move out here looking for trouble. I didn't come to pick fights or challenge anyone's little kingdom. I just wanted quiet, a place to breathe again. But standing on that porch, looking out across the water as the morning fog lifted, something shifted inside me. The silence felt staged. The calm felt thin, fragile, like a curtain pulled shut just long enough to hide whatever waited behind it. And that was the moment I realized the quiet wasn't peace. It was the silence right before someone tried to challenge the wrong man. When I first stepped inside the cabin, the air tasted like dust, old cedar, and something else. Something tired. The kind of tired that only comes from being forgotten for too long. I stood there in the middle of that crooked little room, sunlight slipping through the cracks in the roof like thin gold blades. And for the first time in a long time, I felt purpose. Maybe that's the curse of a man who's spent his life rebuilding things. Even when he swears he's done, his hands remember what to do. So I unpacked the tools I'd promised myself I would never lift again. Each one felt heavier than it used to, like they were testing me, asking if I was sure about this. I wasn't. But I got to work anyway. The first month was demolition. Not the dramatic kind with sledgehammers and shouting. The quiet kind, where you pry each board loose by hand, listening for cracks, learning the weaknesses of the place like a doctor studying an old wound. I pulled out rotten beams, replaced sections of wall eaten alive by time, and found newspapers from 1948 stuffed in the insulation. Someone had once tried to keep this place warm with headlines about Truman and post-war prosperity. I folded one carefully and set it aside. It belonged to the cabin's memory. On the third week, while sanding the floorboards, I thought of my friend again, how he used to whistle when he worked, off-key but steady. The cabin was so quiet without that sound that I caught myself humming just to fill the space. I stopped as soon as I realized. Some ghosts aren't ready to leave, and some memories hurt too much to bring back. But the cabin didn't judge, it just waited. Slowly, board by board, it began to look like something that could stand proud again. By month 4, I started rebuilding the dock. It had tilted so far left, it looked like it was trying to escape into the lake. I spent days knee-deep in water, driving new pylons into the lake bed, feeling the cold bite of the water against my shins. Ducks floated nearby, watching me like disgruntled supervisors. One morning, as I tightened the bolts on a new support beam, I caught a paddleboarder staring at me again, same one from before. She didn't smile, just drifted, silent, studying the dock like it offended her. Then she paddled away without a word. Something about that look stuck with me, like a warning I didn't understand yet. By summer, the cabin began to resemble its old self. The walls stood straighter, the floor didn't creak as much, and the porch, God, that porch, finally felt strong enough to hold weight again. You wouldn't think a porch matters much, but it does. It's where a man stands at the start and the end of each day. It's where decisions settle in your bones. Around that time, I found something in the shed, an old branding iron, rusted but still recognizable. The numbers stamped at the end were faint. 1, 9, 2, 3. I don't know if the original builder carved that sign, or the fisherman who lived here after, or someone decades later. But the second I held it in my hands, I knew exactly what I had to do. I cleaned it, sanded it, restored it just enough so it could function again. Then, one cool evening, with the sky turning orange over Highland Lake, I heated the iron over a small fire until it glowed the color of a dying star. I pressed it into a fresh cedar board. The wood hissed like it was waking up from a long sleep. A deep, dark burn bloomed across the grain, forming the numbers with a stark, weathered beauty. The cabin's year, its origin, its identity. Mounting that board above the porch felt like giving the place its name back. As summer softened into fall, I added the finishing touches. 2 oak barrels filled with wildflowers on either side of the steps. Antique boat lanterns from a Charleston junkyard, restored and fitted with discreet solar panels. Window frames hand-sanded back to life. A chimney made stable with new mortar and stubborn patience. Every morning, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the lake breathe under the early light. And for those first few days, just a few, I felt peace again. The real kind. The kind you don't have to question. But peace is fragile in a place where people fear what doesn't match their perfect view. And on the 7th morning, as I admired the cabin I'd resurrected from rot and memory, I noticed something new. A cream-colored envelope, gold pine tree emblem, neat handwriting, placed on my steps like an offering or a warning. Lake Wind Pines, HOA. That was the moment I knew the cabin wasn't done fighting, and neither was I. I didn't open the envelope right away. Something about the way it sat on the step, perfectly centered, perfectly clean, felt wrong. Like it hadn't just been delivered, but placed there, set down by someone who needed me to know they were close enough to touch my door, close enough to stand on my porch, close enough to make a point. Eventually, I tore it open with my thumb. Inside was a sheet of thick cream-colored paper with gold trim and a scripted header. Lake Wind Pines, Homeowners, Association Architectural Harmony Committee. Whoever designed their stationery thought very highly of themselves. The letter was written in the kind of polite tone only truly unpleasant people manage to perfect, sweet on top, poison underneath. It listed a series of violations in neat bullet points. Unapproved decorative containers, barrels, unauthorized lighting fixtures, lanterns, historic signage, 1923, causing implied status confusion, aesthetic disruption visible from the lake trail. Then, at the bottom, in a flourish of ink, failure to comply within 10 business days will result in a $1,800 fine. Karen Aldridge, chairwoman. I read it twice, then a third time, and the only thing I could think was, they must have lost their damn minds. I wasn't part of their HOA. The cabin stood outside their jurisdiction line by 57 feet, a fact I confirmed before buying the place. My deed didn't include a single reference to Lake Wind Pines. They had no authority over me, none. I walked inside, grabbed a pen, and wrote my reply right across their letter. I am not a member of your HOA. This property is privately owned and falls outside your jurisdiction. Do not contact me again. I taped my response to a photocopy of my deed, slipped it into an envelope, and mailed it first thing the next morning, priority certified, with a smiley face sticker just to make sure the message landed. I figured that would be the end of it. But trouble has a way of arriving quietly at first, like a ripple across water before the wind picks up. 2 days later, I returned from town with groceries in one hand and sandpaper in the other. As I stepped out of the truck, something felt off. The lake was still, but not in its usual peaceful way. More like it was holding its breath. I walked down the path toward the cabin and saw them. 2 men standing on my dock. They weren't dressed like construction workers or surveyors. They wore matching dark polo shirts tucked into crisp khaki pants, with radios clipped neatly at their hips. Embroidered on their chests were 3 little words: Lake Wind Enforcement. The taller one was crouched near my lanterns, snapping photos like he was documenting evidence of a crime. The shorter one stood with his arms folded, looking at my flour barrels as if they personally insulted him. I didn't call out, didn't shout, didn't ask who they were. Instead, I walked to my porch, set the groceries down, pulled out my phone, and started recording. Only then did I speak. "Gentlemen," I said calmly, "can I help you trespass more efficiently?" The taller man stood up slowly. "Sir, we're conducting an architectural compliance sweep per HOA enforcement policy." "Not part of your HOA," I replied, tapping the sign I'd mounted. "Private property, not affiliated with Lake Wind Pines." The shorter one scoffed. "We have authority over all lake-facing structures in the visual corridor. That includes unregulated lighting and non-conforming decor." I pointed toward the property line, those old boulders I knew by heart. "Your authority ends 40 feet that way. You're on the wrong side of the line." He didn't flinch. "If the fine isn't paid by the end of the month," he said, "this situation escalates." "Are you threatening me?" "Just doing our job," he shrugged. Then he pulled out a folded slip of paper, walked past me, and dropped it on my porch like a citation from a traffic cop. A bright red stamp across the top read, "Final Notice." I kept recording as they walked back through the trees. Later that afternoon, I called the sheriff's department. The deputy sounded tired before I even finished explaining. "They're not law enforcement, sir," he said, "and if they weren't violent, it's a civil matter. So people in a fake uniform can walk onto my land and issue fake citations? Sir, I'm sorry, but unless the court rules on a boundary dispute, our hands are tied." I hung up and stared out toward the lake, the breeze brushing across the water like it carried a warning. Something bigger was moving, something old, something planned. And this little inspection was just the first probe. The morning after the so-called inspection, I woke earlier than usual, couldn't sleep much. A man knows when something is off around his home. Doesn't matter if it's a cabin, a barn, or a one-room shack. There's a pressure in the air, like weather building up behind the tree line. I brewed a pot of coffee, stepped onto the porch, and sat in the old rocking chair I'd restored from a termite-bitten skeleton. The lake was quiet, but not the peaceful kind, more like the stillness you see in a dog right before it growls. I replayed yesterday's footage on my phone, the 2 men in their fake enforcement polos, the way they strutted around like deputized mall cops, the way they spoke like the lake belonged to them. I should have felt angry. Instead, I felt something older, a familiar heaviness, a sense of being pulled into a fight I didn't start, but one I was going to have to finish. I decided to drive down to the sheriff's office in person. Phone calls are too easy to dismiss. When a man shows up in boots and looks another man in the eye, truths come out faster. The sheriff wasn't in, but a deputy named Collins was behind the desk. A good man by the way he carried himself, tired but trying. I showed him the video. He watched with his jaw tightening just a little at each sentence those HOA men spit out. "Yeah," he finally said, exhaling through his nose. "We've had a few complaints about them lately." "So do something," I said. He shook his head. "Look, I'm not saying they're right, but according to this," he turned a computer screen toward me, "your dock and your shoreline fall under a shared-use visual zone for Lake Wind Pines, at least according to this map." The map made my stomach drop. It wasn't my map. It wasn't the county's original survey. It was something else. A curved boundary line, small, subtle, drifted just enough across my shore to graze my dock. One single elegant lie. And it changed everything on paper. "That's not my property line," I said, my voice low. "I'm not arguing with you," Collins replied. "But if there's a boundary dispute, official or not, we can't intervene, not until a court sorts it out." In that moment, every piece of this HOA's behavior snapped into place. The stairs, the drifting paddleboarder, the letter, the inspection, the fake authority. They were building a case, one brick at a time, one lie at a time, and now the sheriff's office, without meaning to, was backing their play. "I want to file trespassing charges," I said. "You can," Collins said softly, "but they'll be put on hold until the boundary dispute is resolved." "In their favor," I muttered. He didn't deny it. I drove home with my jaw locked and my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than they needed to. When I parked, the cabin looked different again. Still standing, still proud, but now it looked threatened, as if it understood something I didn't, as if it had seen this fight once before. I walked down to the dock. The planks creaked under my boots, honest, reliable sounds. Sounds that belonged. I knelt and traced my fingers over the fresh bolt heads I'd installed. Each one was a small victory, a claim, a reminder that I had rebuilt this place with sweat and time. There's something sacred about work built by hand. It makes a man protective in ways he can't quite explain. That was when I saw the stake, a small wooden survey stake, driven lightly into the ground near the edge of the path. Pink flagging tape fluttered in the wind like a taunt. I pulled it out easily. Too easily. Someone had placed it there, not hammered it in like a real surveyor would. At the base of the stake, in small black marker, LVPPZ, shoreline zone, lake. Wind pines, property preservation zone, a phrase I had never heard before, because it didn't exist, not legally, not historically, not on any map I trusted. They were creating language, creating justification, creating the foundation for a claim, and they wanted me to see it. That's what made it dangerous. I pocketed the stake and went inside. The cabin's wood was warm from the sunlight, and for a moment, standing in that doorway, I felt the same pull I did the first time I saw the place. A reminder of why I came here, why I stayed, but peace won't protect itself. And it was clear now. Someone was testing how hard they could push before I broke. The thing they didn't understand was, I'm not the breaking type. The next morning, I'd have my answer about just how far they were willing to go. And it would come in the form of their next warning, a warning they made sure I couldn't ignore. The next few days felt different, not louder, not more chaotic, just different. A man doesn't need trouble knocking on his door to know it's coming. Sometimes trouble announces itself by simply changing the air. On day one, I noticed the joggers again. Only this time, they didn't slow down to stare. They pretended not to see me at all, which is worse. There's a kind of hostility that comes quietly, wrapped in politeness, the kind that refuses eye contact, the kind that speaks in lowered voices after you pass, the kind that pretends neutrality while sharpening knives behind closed doors. That was the kind I was dealing with now. By day 3, I saw the same paddleboarder drifting close to the dock again. She didn't even try to hide it this time. She stood on her board, stable as stone, and looked at my cabin with the cold judgment of a woman appraising a stain on a tablecloth. Then she turned around and paddled back to the HOA side of the lake, with a kind of satisfied slowness, like she had confirmed something. By day 5, the real game began. It started with flyers, not mailed, not handed out, just appearing, folded neatly in my mailbox, tucked under a loose board on my fence, left on my porch, held down by a small rock. Each one titled Lake Wind Community. Expectations at the bottom, in bold letters. Outliers undermine harmony. Beautiful phrasing, if you were running a cult. Every time I found one, I tossed it straight in the trash. But, as any man who has lived through conflict knows, the weapon you ignore the most is the one they'll use again and again. Repetition wasn't an accident. This was conditioning. They weren't trying to convince me. They were trying to isolate me, separate me from any potential sympathy, poison me socially, turn me into the outsider before the real fight even began. On the 7th day, I walked into the local hardware store to buy a new masonry trowel. I'd been working on the chimney and needed a better angle on the mortar. Usually, the folks there were friendly, not chatty, but friendly. This time, silence. The man behind the counter didn't greet me, didn't smile, didn't even nod. And the way he kept his distance. It wasn't rudeness, it was fear. The kind people get when someone's whispered something ugly about you, and they don't know whether to believe it. He just said, "Credit or debit," before I even put the trowel on the counter. As I turned to leave, two men in the aisle looked straight at me, then turned their backs and whispered. Not subtly, not even respectfully. Something had shifted, and everyone seemed to know except me. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch and took a long, quiet look at the lake. The stillness didn't comfort me anymore. It felt like a canvas, blank because someone wanted it blank. Peaceful because someone wanted it peaceful. Controlled. The same way HOA communities love to control everything. A place like Lake Wind Pines doesn't tolerate differences, doesn't tolerate personality, doesn't tolerate history that existed before they showed up, and they sure as hell don't tolerate a man fixing up something they thought they had a rightful claim to. That evening, as I locked up the cabin, something caught my eye. A piece of paper stuck between two boards on the side of the porch. Another flyer. This one had an extra line added in pen. Some people don't belong here. Not printed, not official, personal. A message from someone whose house probably matched the others in color, style, and HOA-approved lighting. I held that flyer for a long moment before crumpling it in my fist. It wasn't fear that hit me. It wasn't anger either. It was clarity. They weren't trying to intimidate me physically, yet. They were trying to erase me socially first, cut the town away from me, make me stand alone, make any complaint I filed look like a troublemaker's outburst. That's how coordinated pressure works. That's how groups like this tighten the noose. But what they didn't understand was, I didn't move out here to be part of anything. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their handshake or their welcome basket. I didn't come for harmony. I came for quiet. And they were doing a damn good job of convincing me they were the ones disturbing it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that these whispers, these stares, these little messages were just preparations. Not the attack. Preparations. The kind of groundwork you lay before you attempt something bigger. On the 10th day, I found out what that bigger thing was. And it came in the form of a map. A map that wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous. On the 10th day, the air changed again. But this time, it wasn't subtle. It was sharp, intentional, like someone finally stopped pretending. It started with a knock, not loud, not impatient. Just a single polite knock at the front door. The kind that says, "I know you're home and I'm not leaving." I opened it to find a young woman in a bright orange high-vis vest, holding a clipboard and a measuring wheel. She couldn't have been older than 22. The kind of intern you send to do grunt work while the higher-ups sit in an air-conditioned office and plan trouble. "Oh, hi," she said nervously, adjusting her glasses. "I'm with Lake Wind Pines Infrastructure Review." Wrong answer. "Infrastructure Review," I repeated. "On my property?" She swallowed. "This parcel falls under the Shared Utility Corridor Agreement for the lakeshore." A rehearsed line, practiced, fed to her by someone else. "Show me," I said. She hesitated the way someone hesitates before lying, but eventually she handed me a laminated map. It was neat, clean, color-coded, professionally formatted, and completely wrong. My property line, once straight, simple, and verified, had been replaced with a curved boundary that bent inward just enough to graze the dock. Barely, but enough. Enough to claim oversight, enough to claim visual jurisdiction, enough to claim a right to step onto my land, and enough to start a legal war without firing a shot. I took a picture of the map with my phone and handed it back. "Where did this come from?" I asked. She hesitated again. I just print what they email me." "Who's they?" Chairwoman Aldridge's office, I think." She didn't look like a liar. She looked like someone caught between a paycheck and a conscience. I nodded. "All right, you're done measuring for today." She packed up so quickly she nearly dropped her wheel and jogged back toward the trail, relief written across her shoulders. I stared at the printed map for a long time. A long, cold time. That boundary line wasn't drawn by accident. Someone crafted it. Someone with access, confidence, and an agenda. I went inside, grabbed every legal paper I owned, spread them across the table, and began comparing my deed, the original survey, the GIS screenshots I'd saved, the county plat maps, a decades-old scanned copy from the archives. They all matched. Every single legitimate document matched. But the laminated map the girl brought, it belonged to a different world, a fabricated one. I drove straight to the county clerk's office. The building smelled like mold and bureaucracy, the kind of place where paperwork goes to die. Behind the counter sat Lanny, the middle-aged clerk with horn-rimmed glasses and the posture of someone who had been fighting paper wars since the Reagan era. She recognized me immediately. "Back again?" she asked. I slid the laminated map across the counter. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. "Where did this come from?" HOA intern said it came from the office. She turned toward her computer, typing with the speed of someone who'd been doing it for 30 years. After a few seconds, her screen froze. Not the normal old PC freeze, but the kind that happens when something inside a system doesn't line up. "That's odd," she muttered. "What?" She clicked again. Then again. Finally, she opened the county GIS viewer, the public-facing version. My stomach sank. The online map showed the same curved boundary line. "Lanny," I said slowly, "that's not the official line." She nodded, jaw tight. "I know. That's why this scares me." She opened the internal county map, accessible only to staff. That one showed the correct boundaries. 2 different maps, 2 different versions of the truth. Public version, tampered, internal version, intact. And in the corner of the metadata window, highlighted in faint gray, was the most important detail of all. Last revision submitted by user, Caldridge Admin 2. Revision type, boundary clarification request. Verification, bypassed. I pointed at the screen. "She changed it?" Lanny's voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone with her login did, and they bypassed the second review requirement. Only insiders can do that." She leaned closer. This isn't the first time she's submitted corrections to public files, but we've never had a reason to question them. I felt the slow burn of anger climb up my spine. Not hot, not explosive. Cold, focused. A different kind of anger. The kind that comes from betrayal, of process, of truth, of history. "Can you reverse it?" I asked. Lanny sighed. "Legally, yes. Immediately, no. Once a tampered file has been published, it triggers an administrative review. Slow process, 3 weeks, maybe more. 3 weeks, 3 weeks for them to keep pretending my land was theirs. 3 weeks for them to escalate." I stepped back from the counter. "Thanks," I said. Lanny nodded solemnly. "Be careful, Mr. Greenwell. People don't alter maps unless they plan something." I walked out of the office into the late afternoon light. The sun was starting to set, orange bleeding into the lake like spilled paint. It should have been peaceful, but all I could think about was that curved line on the map, that lie, that quiet, elegant, bureaucratic knife sliding toward my shore. And deep down, in a place I rarely listened to, a truth stirred. They weren't done. Not by a long shot. And whatever they were planning next, it wasn't going to involve paper. It was going to involve fire. I didn't sleep well the night after finding out about the fake map. Didn't sleep at all, really. A man who's lived long enough knows when the ground under him is shifting. It's not a sound, not a sight, just a pressure you feel in your ribs, like a storm rolling in from somewhere you can't see. Around midnight, I stepped outside to check the motion lights along the back of the cabin. Habit, mostly. And maybe a bit of paranoia, not the kind that drives a man crazy, just the kind that keeps him alive. The air was cold enough to bite, still enough to hear the lake breathing. I walked the perimeter with a flashlight in one hand, and my other hand resting near the folding knife I kept in my pocket. The lights were fine. Sensors were responding. No animals prowling around. Nothing unusual, and yet, something was off. When I turned back toward the cabin, that's when I saw it. A faint flicker of orange near the front yard. It wasn't the warm glow of a lantern. It wasn't the soft pulse of a cigarette. It was fire, small, controlled, intentional. I moved faster than my knees usually allow and rounded the corner, just in time to see the last ember fade from the carved cedar sign above the porch. 1923, now blackened, curling inward, smoke rising in thin gray threads. The smell hit next, burnt cedar and varnish, sharp, bitter. A message that didn't need words. Then I saw what the flames had done. The fire had licked the cabin wall behind the sign, leaving a black, jagged scar on the original timber. I touched it. Ash flaked onto my finger. I decided right then. I wasn't sanding it down. I wasn't painting over it. The scar stays. The cabin earned it. But the worst part wasn't the sign. It was the fact that I hadn't heard a damn thing. No footsteps, no whisper, no car, no rustle of clothing. Whoever had done it was quiet, fast, and comfortable moving in the dark. I scanned the yard, the tree line, the dock. Nothing. Just silence. A heavy, knowing silence. I raised my flashlight to check the cameras, and my heart dropped into my stomach. Every single one was dead. Not offline. Not glitched. Dead. The wires hadn't been torn, yanked, or ripped. They had been cut clean. Clean enough to tell me this wasn't the work of bored teenagers or impulsive vandals. This was surgical, professional, planned. Inside the cabin, I checked the DVR, the little unit mounted neatly under a shelf. It wasn't there anymore. I found it on the floor, casing cracked open, circuit board smashed flat. But the back door wasn't kicked in. The lock had been picked, cleanly, quietly, like someone who'd done it 100 times before. A cold breath ran through me. Someone had been inside my home, while I was outside walking the perimeter. If they wanted to hurt me, they could have. If they wanted to confront me, they could have. But they didn't. They wanted something else, to show me they could get in, anytime, anywhere, without a sound. There's a special kind of rage that comes to a man when someone invades his home. Not his property, the home he bled into, the home he rebuilt with his bare hands, the home that helped him survive grief. It's not wild rage, it's cold, mineral, deep in the bones. I felt that kind of anger then, but mixed with it was something else, something older, a memory of my friend who died, of the quiet promise I made to myself to be done fighting. But trouble doesn't care about the promises a man makes to himself. I stepped back outside, cold night air meeting hot breath. The smoldering cedar sign crackled softly, ash drifting to the ground. I took a picture of the burned wood, not for nostalgia, for evidence. Document everything. That's instinct carved into me from decades restoring old structures where the smallest detail matters. Then, for a long time, I just stood there in the dark, listening, thinking, waiting. If they wanted to rattle me, they'd have to do better than this. Fire doesn't scare a man who's already lived through worse. I waited for the anger to cool, but it didn't. It sharpened. It crystallized. After a few minutes, I went into the shed, grabbed a fresh cedar board, and set it down on the porch. Then I took the branding iron, the same one I'd restored earlier, and set it in the coals of the small fire pit. This time, I didn't do it to honor the cabin. This time, I did it to send a message back. When the iron glowed red hot, I pressed it into the cedar. The wood hissed like it was waking up from a long sleep. The numbers burned deeper this time, darker, sharper. 1923, still standing, and beneath it I added something new, a steel plate I'd cut earlier but hadn't mounted yet. Private property. Not part of any HOA trespassers will be prosecuted. In the glow of the fire, the letters looked almost alive. Someone out there had made their first move, a coward's move, a shadow's move. But they'd awakened something in me they shouldn't have. They wanted fear. What they got instead was resolve, and I had a feeling they weren't going to like what came next. I didn't sleep after the fire. Instead, I installed new eyes, hidden cameras, infrared sensors, traps for the ghosts trying to scare me off. And I didn't have to wait long. Just before dawn, my phone buzzed. A single image captured by the motion sensor near the porch, a gloved hand, reaching for the burned railing. The timestamp was 3 a.m. Whoever it was knew exactly where my old blind spots were. They moved with the confidence of someone who had hunted here before. That's when it hit me. This wasn't harassment. This was a cycle. And if I wanted to break it, I needed to know who fought this war before me. I drove straight to the county records office. Lanny, the clerk, looked at me over her horn-rimmed glasses like I was a recurring headache. Maps, she guessed. History, I corrected. Everything on the cabin before 1995. She disappeared into the archives and returned with a dusty box labeled Morton vs. Lake Wind Pines, 1992. I opened it, and the truth spilled out. The HOA had tried this exact same playbook 30 years ago. They claimed the shoreline shifted. They claimed jurisdiction. But Ellis Morton, the previous owner, fought back. He won a permanent injunction in 1992, banning the HOA from ever claiming the land. He was a stubborn old mule, Lanny said softly, looking at the file. He used to say the lake was for everyone, except the people who wanted to own all of it. Did he say why they wanted it? I asked. Shoreline, she whispered. Control the shore, control the development rights. That's where the money is. I took photos of every document, but I needed more than paper. I needed the man's blessing. I tracked down his granddaughter, Rebecca Morton, in Atlanta that same afternoon. When she saw me standing at her door, she didn't look surprised. She just pointed to a battered cardboard box in her living room. Granddad kept that for the next owner, she said. She handed me a sealed envelope from the bottom of the box. He had a name for them, you know, she added with a dry smile. Termites in polo shirts. I opened the letter. The handwriting was strong, blue ink on yellowed paper. If you're reading this, they're trying again. This house stands because I fought for it. Don't let them win. Ellis Morton. I stood there, holding the letter, feeling the weight of the box in my hands. The gloved hand in the dark thought I was just a lonely man in a wooden shack. They didn't know I had just inherited an army. The fight wasn't new, it was legacy. And now, it was my turn. I drove back from Atlanta with Morton's box riding shotgun beside me like an old friend. Every bump in the road rattled the lid, as if the man himself was tapping it, whispering, "Don't let them win." By the time I reached the lake, the sun was already dipping low, turning Highland Lake into a sheet of hammered copper. The cabin sat quiet, still carrying the faint smell of burned cedar from the night before. That jagged black scar on the wall caught the dying light and looked almost alive. I unlocked the door, set the box on the table, and exhaled a long breath that didn't do a damn thing to calm me down. I knew what had to come next. War, just not the kind that involved guns or fists. But before I could start pulling papers together, a vehicle rolled up the gravel, a beige sedan, government plates, perfect. I stepped out onto the porch just as a man climbed out, a tall, narrow fellow in a beige blazer, hair neatly parted, clipboard tucked under his arm like it was a moral compass. He didn't smile. "Good afternoon, sir," he called out. "My name is Blaker. I'm with the county assessor's office." Of course he was. He walked toward me with that practiced step bureaucrats have, confident but not too quick, measured enough to look official without looking threatening. "I'm here regarding a notice of discrepancy filed in relation to your parcel," he said, "specifically the eastern boundary." He said it like he was reciting a weather report. I kept my face still. "I didn't file anything." He cleared his throat. A concerned party flagged an ownership anomaly. There it was, a concerned party. The polite way of saying HOA. Karen pulled some strings. I gestured toward the dock. "Let's walk." We made our way down the worn path, boots crunching the gravel, the lake wind brushing past us like it wanted to warn me. The assessor took notes, drew little shapes, hummed thoughtfully. Everything these people do when they're pretending neutrality, but already know which way the wind's blowing. When we reached the shoreline, he crouched down, studied the marker stones, nodded slowly. "Well," he said, standing again, "one temporary solution here would be for Lake Wind Pines to assume management of this shoreline until the discrepancy is resolved officially. It would streamline oversight and reduce risk." My jaw tightened. "Streamline," I repeated, as in, hand over part of my property to a private HOA. He smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he's being reasonable. "Only temporarily, a custodial arrangement." Custodial arrangement. I'd heard that phrase before. It's what you use when you want to take something, but you don't want to sound like you're taking it. I kept my voice low and even. "Mr. Blaker, are you suggesting I give control of my shoreline to the very people who have been trespassing, harassing, and falsifying documents about it?" He blinked. "I'm simply outlining an option." "It's not an option." He hesitated, then scribbled something on his clipboard, probably non-compliant, uncooperative, or refuses to roll over. When we got back to the porch, I handed him a cold bottle of water. Not kindness, just civility done right, the kind Karen would never understand. He twisted the cap off, nodded politely. "Expect an official reassessment notice within the week," he said. I gave a thin smile. "Oh, I expect a lot of things." He paused, studying me like he wasn't sure what I meant. Then he left. As soon as his car disappeared down the road, I went inside, pulled Morton's box toward me, spread the documents across the table, and called the only person who might actually love a fight like this. Clayton Sharp, attorney at law. A man with a voice like gravel in a coffee grinder. He picked up on the second ring. "Talk to me." I told him everything. The assessor, the concerned party, the custodial arrangement suggestion, the sudden urgency of the reassessment. Clayton snorted. "Classic pressure tactic. They're trying to create enough administrative smoke that somebody, maybe even a judge, throws up their hands and says, 'Fine, let the HOA manage it until we sort this out.' Can they do that? Legally, no. Administratively, sometimes. That's why they're pushing hard." I took a breath. "We need to hit them back." "Oh, we will," he said. "But we need ammo, real ammo. Tell me you found something." I looked at the table. 1947 maps. 1992 injunction. 2006 registry attempt. Morton's handwritten letter. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I found a war chest." "Good," Clayton said. "Then here's what we do next." He laid it out. "File a challenge to the reassessment. Freeze the process before it begins. Submit Morton's injunction as evidence of prior judicial protection. Request an emergency hearing to prevent custodial mismanagement. Force the county to acknowledge the historic registry attempt. Introduce the original shoreline survey from Morton's records." Each step was a hammer, each document a nail. But then Clayton said something that made the room feel colder. "Matt, listen carefully. If the assessor showed up this quickly, someone leaned on him hard. That means you're not just fighting an HOA anymore. There's someone behind them with money on the table." I stared out the window at the darkening lake. Someone with money on the table. Someone willing to set fires in the night and pick locks and walk right up to the edge of the woods to watch me sleep. "Then we find out who," I said. Clayton's voice sharpened with approval. "That's the spirit. I'll draft the filings tonight. You get some rest." Rest. I didn't even remember what that felt like. After the call, I walked down to the dock, stood at the edge where the assessor had been, stared at the rippling water. The lake looked peaceful. But peace is a trick, a surface that hides teeth underneath. Morton fought them. They tried again. Now they were trying harder. But now I had something they didn't expect. History, evidence, and a stubborn streak that made Morton look gentle. I whispered into the wind, not for drama, but because it felt right. "They're not getting an inch." Behind me, the cabin stood dark and silent, the scorched wall glowing faintly in the moonlight. A reminder, a promise, a warning. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Not in a courthouse, not even in a municipal annex, but inside Lake Windpine's community clubhouse, the kind of place where HOA boards usually meet to argue about lawn heights and mailbox colors. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a trap built out of folding chairs and self-importance. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. 3 board members sat behind a long plastic table draped with a green cloth, like they were judges in some off-brand courtroom. Behind them hung a sign, Architectural Standards, Review, Panel Serving, Lake Communities. Since 2008 serving. Sure. To their left sat 2 representatives from neighboring HOAs, both in navy blazers, both wearing expressions that spelled out their real job. Rubber stamp, whatever Lake Wind wants. Then Karen walked in, tall, composed. A navy pantsuit tailored so sharp it could probably slice fruit. Her hair was pulled into that signature bun, tight enough to hold grudges, tighter still to choke the truth. Behind her trailed 2 HOA board members carrying a binder so thick it looked like a weapon. Karen smiled at me, but it wasn't a greeting. It was an obituary delivered early. "Mr. Greenwell," she said sweetly, "thank you for attending. We hope to resolve your situation today." I didn't answer. Clayton stood beside me, arms crossed, chin tilted slightly like he was measuring the room's integrity and finding it lacking. The chairwoman, a Ms. Dunley, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. This hearing is to determine whether Mr. Greenwell's restoration of the property at the North Shore has violated lakeside aesthetic cohesion under visual easement doctrine. Clayton raised one finger. Objection. Yes, Dunley said. Visual easement doctrine doesn't exist. The room stirred. Karen leaned forward, lips tightening. It exists within our charter, she said, and our charter applies to all lake-facing structures. Clayton turned to look at her calmly. Your charter applies to your members. Mr. Greenwell is not one. Karen's smile thinned. That is a point of debate. No, it's not, Clayton said. It's a matter of deed. The room tensed, but Dunley waved a hand. We will determine jurisdiction after hearing all evidence. Of course she would. That's how kangaroo courts work. They pretend to keep an open mind while the verdict's already been written in red pen. Karen stood, opened her binder theatrically, and began. First, we'd like to address the lanterns Mr. Greenwell installed. These produce unregulated illumination patterns visible from community trails, disrupting continuity. She clicked a remote. A slide popped onto the projector. A zoomed-in, overexposed photo of my antique lanterns glowing softly by the dock. Next image, my flower barrels. Unapproved containers, Karen said. Potential nesting zones for invasive wildlife. Next, my 1923 sign. This wooden plaque is misleading and emotionally manipulative. It implies historic significance where none has been officially granted. Then she locked her eyes onto mine. And finally, Mr. Greenwell's overall restoration appears intentionally designed to provoke nostalgia-driven defiance, clashing with the community vision. It was the most backhanded compliment I'd ever received. Clayton leaned over to me and whispered, She rehearsed that in the mirror. Now it was our turn. Clayton stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate the theatrics, but let's be clear. He opened our binder, much thinner, no props needed. This property is not within the HOA. It has never been within the HOA, and in fact, the HOA is under a permanent court injunction issued in 1992, banning them from ever making claims on it. He slid a copy of the injunction across the table. Dunley lifted it with 2 fingers, like it was a dead lizard. Karen's jaw twitched. Clayton continued. What's more, this property was submitted for historic registry status. The application was thorough and complete. The only reason it was suspended was because... He paused. Because this was the blow that mattered. Lake Wind Pines filed an objection claiming the structure fell under their jurisdiction. That claim was false then, and it is false now. A murmur rolled across the room. Karen opened her mouth, but Clayton raised a second document before she could speak. And finally, he said, we subpoenaed the original shoreline zoning file from the county. What Ms. Aldridge submitted, he tapped the binder Karen brought, is a doctored version. The room went dead silent. Dunley stared. Doctored? Clayton nodded. The formatting, stamps, and metadata do not match the county's official files. In fact, the digital compilation appears to have been created on Ms. Aldridge's personal device. Karen shot to her feet. That is outrageous! Our zoning contractor prepared those files. Clayton tilted his head. Ms. Aldridge, would you like to explain why the metadata shows your login credentials? Gasps. A chair scraped. One of the neighboring HOA reps swallowed hard enough to hear it. Karen's face flushed, red creeping up her neck like anger meeting fear halfway. This is unprofessional, she snapped. Irrelevant. This hearing is about a violation of visual... Dunley cut her off. Sit down, Ms. Aldridge. That surprised everyone. Even Clayton blinked. Dunley removed her glasses, pinched the bridge of her nose, then looked at me directly for the first time. It appears, she said slowly, that this proceeding may have been initiated under questionable premises. Her voice weakened on the last words, like she finally realized she was tied to a sinking ship. Karen's hands tightened on the binder, not shaking, but close. Dunley turned to Clayton. I'm halting this arbitration pending review by District Civil Court. This board will not be used to adjudicate matters that involve potential document tampering. Clayton nodded politely, hiding the smirk behind his professional mask. I stayed quiet. Karen didn't blink, didn't move, didn't breathe. But her Her eyes burned into me like the fire that scorched my wall. On the way out, Clayton patted my shoulder. "That was the first crack," he said. "Now we widen it." I nodded, but in my gut, I felt something else. Karen wasn't the type to lose quietly. She was the type to double down. And the next move she made wouldn't be in a clubhouse with folding chairs. It would be in the dark. Civil court didn't look anything like the HOA clubhouse. There were no folding chairs, no plastic tables, no power-tripping women in pantsuits pretending to be judges. Just a real courtroom with a real judge and a flag behind her that meant something. Clayton and I took our seats at the respondents' table while Karen strutted in with her legal team, 3 attorneys in slick charcoal suits, and an attitude that smelled like entitlement and lavender lotion. She refused to look at me as she sat down. Good. It meant she was scared enough to pretend she wasn't. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, a woman in her early 60s, gray streak in her hair, eyes sharp as sewing needles, adjusted her glasses and glanced over the docket. "Case number 24-381, she read. Lake Wind Pines Homeowners Association versus Matthew Greenwell. Allegations, aesthetic disruption, boundary violation, unsafe structural modifications, and noncompliance with community standards." Clayton rose immediately. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss." The judge lifted an eyebrow. "That's bold, Mr. Sharp. On what grounds?" Clayton held up a single document. "On the grounds that this HOA has no jurisdiction whatsoever over my client's privately owned property. And furthermore, they are barred from filing any claim by a permanent injunction issued in 1992. He walked the injunction to the clerk's desk, letting the paper land with a soft slap that echoed louder than it should have. The judge skimmed the first page, then the second. Her expression didn't change, but the air in the room did. Karen's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, that injunction is outdated. The shoreline has shifted naturally since then, changing jurisdiction." Clayton didn't even turn his head. "No, it hasn't." He lifted a USB drive and a thick packet of drone photographs. "These were taken last month. Shoreline markers match the original 1947 survey exactly. No shift, no erosion, no jurisdictional change." The judge tapped her pen once. "Filed," she said. "Proceed." Karen's attorney tried again. "Your Honor, Mr. Greenwell restored the property in a way that disrupts the contiguous visual harmony of the lake community." Clayton cut him off. "Your Honor, we also move to strike that argument. There is no such thing as a visual easement doctrine. The term is fabricated." "That's not true," Karen snapped before her lawyer could stop her. "It's a recognized standard in—" "Ms. Aldridge," the judge said sharply, "you will speak only when addressed." Karen went quiet, but her eyes boiled. Next came the witnesses. The HOA called their first. A man in a green vest who claimed to be a community standards consultant. He held up photos of my lanterns, my dock, my flower barrels. "These elements," he said, "create discordant visual signatures that detract from—" Clayton leaned back and whispered to me, "He's using words he doesn't understand. This is going to be fun." When the judge allowed cross-examination, Clayton didn't walk. He strolled. "Sir," he said, "in your professional opinion, are these barrels dangerous?" The consultant puffed up. "They could harbor invasive wildlife." Clayton stared at him for one long, silent second. Then he asked, "Have you ever seen a raccoon in a barrel?" Well, hypothetically, Clayton repeated. "Do you believe raccoons need barrels to exist?" The courtroom cracked with muffled laughter. Even the judge smirked. The consultant shrank 2 inches. Next, Karen took the stand. She swore herself in with a tight jaw and eyes that avoided mine. "Ms. Aldridge," her lawyer began, "would you describe the impact Mr. Greenwell's restoration has had on the community?" She launched into it like a sermon. "He destabilizes community cohesion. His aesthetic choices undermine long-term property values. He refuses to respect the rules that preserve the identity of Lake Wind Pines. Clayton rose. "Objection." "On what grounds?" the judge asked. "On the grounds that she's testifying about a community my client does not belong to." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Move on." Karen's lawyer tried another angle. "Ms. Aldridge, did you ever attempt to communicate concerns to Mr. Greenwell in good faith?" "Yes," she said immediately. "I sent letters, notices, even a courtesy team to explain—" Clayton's voice cut through the air like a saw. A courtesy team? You mean the two unlicensed men in matching polos who trespassed on my client's dock and issued fabricated citations? Karen froze. Her lawyer coughed. Let's rephrase. No need, the judge said. I'd like to hear Ms. Aldridge answer. Karen swallowed. They were volunteers. Clayton smiled, cold, polite. Volunteers who carried radios, wore enforcement patches, and threatened fines. Volunteers who trespassed on land protected by a court order. Karen's lips parted, but no sound came out. Your Honor, Clayton said, I'd like to call our witness. The judge nodded. Proceed. Our first witness, Rebecca Morton. She walked in wearing a simple blazer, holding her grandfather's box as if it were a living thing. She sat down, was sworn in, then looked directly at Karen. My grandfather fought them, she said calmly. Fought them for decades. They tried to steal the cabin in 1992. He won in court. They hated him for it. And when he tried to preserve the cabin's history in 2006, Lake Wind Pines filed an objection using false claims. Clayton handed her a photo, her grandfather in uniform in 1962, standing in front of the cabin with pride in his posture and a shotgun resting by the door. Ms. Morton, Clayton asked, what did your grandfather say about the HOA? She smiled faintly. He said they were termites in polo shirts, and he said one day they'd try again. Karen's face drained of color. The judge took notes quickly. Our final witness, Lanny, the county clerk. She took the stand like a woman carrying an entire file system on her shoulders. Under oath, she spoke clear and steady. The digital shoreline zoning file was altered, she said. Revision logs were overwritten using credentials assigned to Ms. Karen Aldridge. The courtroom didn't breathe. Karen's lawyer whispered, we should adjourn. But Clayton wasn't finished. He raised a final document. And this, he said, is the untouched original file from county servers. Stamp, formatting, metadata, all authentic. They contradict every map the HOA presented. The judge closed her binder. Then she looked at Karen, long, hard, unforgiving. Ms. Aldridge, she said, prepare yourself. This is no longer a civil hearing. This is evidence of deliberate fraud. Karen finally blinked, and her entire facade cracked. The judge turned to us. Mr. Greenwell, your ownership is hereby affirmed and protected. The HOA's claims are dismissed with prejudice. We will reconvene regarding damages and potential criminal referral. Clayton whispered to me, that's not a win. That's a landslide. But as I stood, I felt something else. This wasn't over, because people like Karen don't break cleanly. They shatter, and sharp things cut on the way down. The verdict didn't land all at once. Justice rarely does. It comes in layers, like the rings inside a tree trunk, marking every season it had to endure. 2 weeks after the civil court ruling, the criminal charges were filed. Document tampering, public record interference, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit property seizure. Hearing the list out loud felt surreal. Watching Karen's face as the district prosecutor read each count, that felt right. Her expression wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't arrogance. It was disbelief. The kind a person feels when the world finally refuses to bend for them. For the first time, she understood the one thing people like her never imagine. Boundaries apply to them too. The HOA board fragmented immediately. 2 members resigned. One tried to blame Karen publicly. Another cried on a local news interview about unfair treatment of volunteer community leaders. The community itself, silent, cold, afraid of being associated with the woman who tried to rewrite the lake to suit her reflection. But the lake didn't care who she was, and neither did the law. The county restored the correct zoning files. The injunction was reaffirmed, and the cabin, my cabin, was officially granted historic property status, complete with a bronze certification plaque mailed in a padded envelope like a quiet medal. When I opened it, I just stared. It felt less like recognition and more like an apology from time itself. Rebecca drove up that afternoon, brought a pie, didn't say much, just stood on the dock with me, watching the wind push the lake into small silver ripples. Well, she finally said, I think Granddad would have liked you. I nodded. I hope so. She nudged me gently. He definitely would have enjoyed what you're about to do next. I smiled, because yes, I'd been waiting for this part. The new sign was already propped on my workbench. Thick cedar, sand-smooth edges, the letters carved clean and deep. I heated the branding iron until it glowed an angry orange, the same one I used the first week I bought the cabin. The metal hummed as it came alive, and when I pressed it into the wood, the burn sang out with that slow, satisfying sizzle that smells like history being sealed into place. When I lifted the iron, the letters stood dark and perfect. 1923, Fisherman's Cabin. Survived 3 court battles. I added one more line beneath it, not carved, but on a polished steel plate bolted tight and unmistakable. Not part of any HOA visitor's welcome unless your name is Karen. I mounted the sign beside the porch, stood back, let the wind carry the scent of fresh cedar and hot metal out over the water. The scar from the fire was still on the wall. Jagged, black, honest. I'd never sand it down. Some scars don't need hiding, they need remembering. As the sun set, the lake turned gold. The kind of gold money can't buy and HOAs can't regulate. I sat on the dock with a beer, thinking about Morton's letter, thinking about the night they burned my sign, thinking about the gloved hand at the edge of the woods, thinking about all the lines they crossed, and the one line I finally drew myself, a real one, a permanent one. The judge's words echoed in my memory. The land is yours. It always was. The lake lapped quietly against the posts. The lanterns flickered with their soft, antique glow. And for the first time in months, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't watching me. It was home.